Shalom. So we've been studying about the generation of the desert, and now, this week, we're reading Parashat Chukat. And 6 Torah portions into the book of Numbers, we've been speaking so much about this incorrigible generation, and after the trauma of the incident of the spies, after last week's confrontation with Korach, that unbridled hubris, we may really have a bad taste in our mouths. We may really have the impression that this generation was that incorrigible, that this generation was just so contradictory and so full of missed opportunities. And we may have, God forbid, a very negative impression of them. Again, especially after Parashat Shalach, the debacle of the spies, Parashat Korach, with that confrontation, the overall impression that we have is of a generation that was unappreciative, that was constantly trying God, that was constantly failing in tests of faith. But we mustn't forget that this generation was the highest of the high, literally described as human angels. They were people on such a sublime level of spiritual perception and closeness to God. It takes a real man to eat the manna, which is called man. It takes a real accomplished, powerful personality to be able to digest that spiritual food and remain on your feet. It was a constant test. These are the people that drank from the well, the water of the well of Miriam. These are the people that heard God's voice at Sinai. These people were massive, staggering personalities, intellects, souls. Yes, they had many, many faults, as do we all. And this is one of the incredible ideas that the Torah is conveying to us by recording the details of the failings of this generation, especially when we realize that it's really up to us to fix that generation and to be the ones who come into Eretz Israel with our arms open wide to embrace the precious land that God is giving us and to overcome all of the trials. So it's not so simple. Yes, we've seen the dark underbelly of that generation. We've seen the dark side. We've seen a lot of the failings, but we also know, and we mustn't ever forget, that they were truly great. This is what a person is. Up, down, as high as the stars, as low as the sand on the sea. And if anything, when we come to this point, 6 parshiot into the book of Numbers, trying to put a finger on this tremendous force, the generation of the desert, and following through their ups and downs now, can you imagine what they're going through now? They were at the pinnacle of the potential of possibility. They were ready to pass into the promised land when they rose to the miserable failure of accepting the tale-bearing, the evil speech against the land of Israel. And so the decree was made, and they're going to be wandering around for another 38 years in the desert. What was everyday life then? What was it like knowing these great men and women? The women actually were even greater, because the women did go into the land of Israel. The women were not included in the decree, but these great men, because these women were so high that they did not accept the Lashon Hara, they did not believe it. So the women who were older, they went in with a younger generation of men. But again, I digress. That generation, they received that decree. They knew that they would be dying in the desert. And they're just living out their lives still in closeness to Hashem. They're still receiving the manna. They're still living out their lives. They're like totally connected to the Torah from Sinai. And if anything, this Torah portion, Parashat Chukat, really teaches us that we don't know anything. And that takes a lot of humility to be able to admit, what do we know anyway? There's a verse in Psalms that tells us the beginning of knowledge is the fear of God. And that actually is parallel to another statement that our sages make, that the goal of all knowledge is for us to know, for us to realize that really we don't know anything. And those concepts are really totally epitomized by the concept of the parah adumah, the statute of the Red Heifer, which introduces this week's Torah portion. Parashat Chukat, chapter 19 of the book of Numbers, deals with the mystery of the Red Heifer. We call it a mystery because it is acknowledged by the sages of Israel to be the very embodiment of the concept of a commandment that God gives over to Israel, which is beyond the scope of the possibility of human comprehension. Something that we have to accept because God commands it, but the workings of which is considered to be a chok. That's the category of the commandments which God commands us without our being entitled to an explanation. We can still seek an explanation, we can engage in all sorts of speculation and commentary, which is all very beautiful, and which we're actually commanded to do, to beautify our understanding of Torah. But ultimately we have to understand that no human being can really comprehend the principles behind the structure of, the reasoning of, and the dynamics of the commandment of the Red Heifer, which essentially is the single, universal, exclusive antidote to the restoration of purity that can circumvent the impurity. And these are, again, terms that don't allude to any sort of physical soiling or any sort of actual tangible impurity, but these are spiritual concepts of imbalance. And we're talking here about the tumah, the level of spiritual impurity that is brought about by exposure to death. And the only recipe to counter that strong, invading, invasive, all-pervading type of impurity is the process described here in chapter 19 of the book of Numbers, the beginning of Parashat Chukat, process of purification through the sprinkling of the ashes of the Red Heifer, with all the details that are involved there. And this idea of how this works, why should such a thing, the slaughtering and the burning of this particular animal, which is so unusual to come by, this perfectly red cow of 3 years of age without even 2 hairs of any other color, that can't have any of these blemishes, that can never have been used for work, how that works and how its slaughtering and burning and its ashes mixed with live water, fresh water, brings about this paradigm shift of reality back to the side of purity. About this, King Solomon, who was considered to be the wisest of all men, dedicated a verse in the book of the scroll of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 23, wherein he said, I said I would become wise, but I see that it is far from me. Yet, there is a tradition that Moshe Rabbeinu, that Moses, he did understand the secret of the parah adumah. And there's also an idea that in the future, in the rectified world, Israel will be collectively, the entire nation, on the level of understanding that we too, every single person, will eventually understand the chok, the ordinance, the mystery of the Red Heifer. But all now that we really know about it is that it's somehow connected to the stain of death, of spiritual death, which was brought about through the golden calf. There's some sort of connection. And we also know that the Red Heifer is the symbol of humility, in that it is the symbol of self-nullification. And it's the opposite of a person who is self-aggrandizing. Like Moshe Rabbeinu, for example, who drops the aleph when he says, Nachnu ma, what are we? And Moshe Rabbeinu, who back in Exodus, in the incident of the golden calf, was able to say to Hashem, if you don't forgive the people of Israel, not only do I not want you to make a new nation from me, but erase my name from your book. I want it to be as if I was never even here, because I can't face life. I don't want to be here. I don't want to ever have been thought of without my precious nation of Israel. So he was able to say, erase my name from your book. This is the ultimate idea of humility, as God himself testified back in the end of Parashat Ba'alotcha, where he said to Aaron and to Miriam, how could you talk about Moshe? Don't you know that he is faithful completely everywhere in my house? And that's where Hashem actually said that Moshe was the humblest man on the face of the earth. So this is part of another aspect of the mystery of the red heifer, which is actually, speaking of how we don't even know anything, and how this Torah portion really is the embodiment of the concept that we really don't understand anything. Why is it even mentioned here? Because actually the precept, again the ordinance, the chok of the red heifer was given to Israel back at the place called Marah, where the bitter waters were sweetened in Parashat Bishalach, in chapter 15 of the book of Exodus. This is one of the commandments which, according to our tradition, was given to Israel back then. And yet, for some reason, it only appears here in Parashat Chukat. It's completely out of place. That doesn't surprise us, because we all know that there is not necessarily any chronological order whatsoever in the Torah. The Torah is not a book of history, and therefore there isn't any chronological order. And one of the reasons why parah adumah, the red heifer, appears where it does, right here, following Parashat Korach, is because it was only Moshe who was able to understand the secret of the red heifer. In fact, there's a certain kind of eternal connection between Moshe and the red heifer. Indeed, the verse tells us Hashem spoke to Moshe and Aaron, saying, this is the ordinance, the decree of the Torah which Hashem has commanded, saying, speak to the children of Israel, and they shall take to you a completely red cow. There is a personal association between the red heifer and Moshe, and that's because he had this deep comprehension that even Shlomo HaMelech, even King Solomon, who, according to the testimony of Torah, was privy to every secret of creation, every secret of the universe, every nuance of every natural phenomena, every language, the language of the birds, the constellations. There's nothing, no wisdom, no discipline that he didn't understand, but yet he was not able to fathom the mystery of the red heifer. But Moshe, he did understand. And why is that? So the timing, again, the chronology is very beautiful, because some of our rabbis point out that's why this parsha appears where it does in the Torah, because it's following Parashat Korach, even though its natural place is back in chapter 15 of the book of Exodus. The idea being that, Korach, as we mentioned last week, he was all about himself. His whole perception was, where does everything fit in the grand scheme of the universe that is me? And it was all about himself. He wasn't able to put himself aside. And in order to be a leader, and in order to really stand in for the nation and say, erase me from your book, you have to be in a place where you're able to put yourself aside completely. Korach looked at Moshe and he said, how could one person be so many things? You're the prophet, you're the king, you're the Kohen, you're everything all together. Because Korach looked at himself and said, I know if I was all of those things, if I wore all of those hats, I'd be so full of myself that I would burst and the pieces would be on all the walls. But he looked at Moshe and saw that that wasn't the case. And this is the answer, Hashem's answer, as it were. Through the timing of the Torah, Hashem's answer to Korach is, this is why he is who he is and you are who you are, because he is able to understand this secret, because he thinks nothing of himself. And that's really we know part of the secret of the red heifer is this concept of bitul, of self-nullification, of which Moshe was the master. And that in itself is such a beautiful thought, that the secret of purity and the secret of undoing the damaging, debilitating illusion of death is to realize that we are nothing and we have nothing. That's the secret of purity. So now that the children of Israel are preparing to go in, parah adumah is recorded here. And this red heifer is a symbol of the endless depth of knowledge, which hovers all around us, which is at our fingertips, and yet the beginning of knowledge is the fear of God. That's all we really have, and the knowledge that we really don't know anything. That's really the paradigm of this week's Torah portion, because there are so many things that are unseen and that we don't really understand. And what a beautiful beginning of this parsha, the decree of the red heifer, which is beyond our understanding. And this parsha seems to be full of death in a way, because it begins with the concept of the purification from death, which is the concept of the red heifer. And then, of course, we have the debacle of the mistake that Moshe Rabbeinu made with hitting the rock instead of speaking to it. So we have the death of Aaron, the death of Miriam, and the understanding of Moshe's finite future, that he too will die, that he will not enter into the land of Israel. But of course, we know that death is not the end, and the sages teach us indeed that ultimately Moshe will bring the children of Israel into the land of Israel, but not that generation. So parah adumah not only is the symbol of endless depth of knowledge, but it's also the instrument of purity. In a way, it's a parallel to new life. It's a parallel to Eden, to Gan Eden, which, of course, this is the whole goal, to fix that which came about from the original mistake, as it were, which was actually Adam HaRishon's choice that he made because he wanted to know how to serve God with the evil inclination as well. And so now the children of Israel are looking to make the tikkun, the rectification of all of this, of all of history, to go into the land of Israel parallel to Gan Eden, and to make this world into the Garden of Eden. And so all of these unseen factors in Parashat Chukat, the celebration of the unseen, the celebration of purity, the secret of Moshe's choice that we learn about, the well of water which accompanied the children of Israel throughout their desert wanderings was in the merit of Miriam. Now, in this week's Torah portion, with the passing of Miriam, the well disappears, the well dries up, and this is the background of what happened with Moshe. And all of the commentaries are all torn up about how could Moshe have made a mistake, and they're full of all sorts of different ideas that it was the wrong rock, that he thought it was one rock. You see, because the way that the well of Miriam worked was that it was hidden inside a particular rock, which moved about with the congregation as it traveled throughout the desert. And this is a tremendous concept, this hidden well of Miriam. And the way that it worked when Miriam was alive is that the rock stood in the encampment of Israel, and all the princes, the Nisiim, all the princes of all the tribes would stand around, and they would sing a certain song. And the water would rush forth from the rock, and it would form little tributaries, or little side streams that would encompass the entire encampment. And every tribe of Israel had a stream running by its particular camp, and from the stream came forth all sorts of delicacies in addition to sweet water, and all sorts of fruit-bearing trees would spring up around this tributary of water. And now all of that disappeared. And so there's a question, where is the stone? And perhaps Moshe thought that it was one stone. Perhaps he thought for some reason that it was better for certain reasons, that he had certain logic to do this instead of to do that. Perhaps he was put into a certain situation, or perhaps he didn't understand. And this is not the place to go into all of that speculation, because it's quite involved. Suffice it to say, Moshe did not make a mistake. He knew exactly what he was doing. And just as Adam and Chava really made a choice in the Garden of Eden, so too Moshe made a choice, and he knew ultimately, and this was his ultimate sacrifice, because there's nothing that he wanted as much as going into the land of Israel. He knew that for the sake of the children of Israel's future, for certain reasons, it was necessary for him to take this dive, and to make sure that there would be a reason for him not to be able to go into the land of Israel. But it seems that he made some sort of cosmic mistake, and so the irony of Parashat Chukat is that in the very same Torah portion that begins with a testimony from God himself as to the greatness of Moshe Rabbeinu, that he was the only person who was able to fathom and plumb the depths of the secret of parah adumah, of the red heifer, because he had such tremendous humility, the very same Torah portion immediately thereafter records the greatest single mistake of his career, which cost him entering into the land of Israel. What a contrast from the greatest testimony to his greatness to an open record of his failure? Unless, of course, it was not a failure, but it was part of his understanding of how to ensure the future of the children of Israel. This is a very complex notion, but in short, there are so many adventures that this generation went through that are all in the background of these Torah portions, between the lines, and they're not even recorded. From the time that the spies were sent forth from Kadesh Barnea until the death of Miriam is a span of 38 years. What happened during those years? The Torah only bothers to record those incidents of eternal importance. And we are really left to our own imagination to understand the tremendous detail of everything that passed over them during those years. From the time that the decree was made against that generation, the decree of death, every year on the eve of Tisha B'Av, the entire nation would dig graves. The Midrash tells us that after the decree of death was made against that generation, people didn't die just on any day. They didn't die just in the middle of a Wednesday in February, but those who were going to be dying that year would pass away on the night of Tisha B'Av, the day of the decree. And so every year on the eve of Tisha B'Av, the entire nation dug graves, and that night, the night of Tisha B'Av, the destruction of the temple, all the males that were of age, that were involved in that terrible sin of speaking Lashon Hara against the land of Israel, would sleep in the grave. And in the morning, Moshe would pass through the camp and make an announcement that all those who are still alive should rise up and join the rest of the nation, and the others were buried there, in the very own graves that they dug, which they had already dug when they accepted that terrible speech against the land of Israel. Imagine what goes into this. Imagine the scene every year of all of those tzaddikim parting from their families. Imagine the paperwork of seeing to it that all of their affairs were in order, and then saying goodbye. And then the next morning saying hello again and having a wonderful reunion for maybe another year or more for those whose time had not yet come. My point being, there's so much between the lines in these 38 years in the desert of all the experiences that this great generation had, this generation that was so close to holiness and so close to God, and only those aspects that are of import to us that we are able to grow from and to even effect a change for are those that are recorded. In Parashat Chukat, with the parah adumah, with the decree that was made against Moshe because of the incident at the rock, which frankly no one really understands adequately what that really truly is conveying. And the death of Miriam, and the disappearance of the well, and the passing of the mantle of the priesthood from Aaron to his sons, and the wars that are described, all of these speak more of what we don't know than really what we do know. They are an allusion to the impenetrable, endless depth of knowledge of this generation, which is passed on to us. Thus, the parsha begins with the parah adumah. Moshe is not going into the land of Israel. His first order of business after he's told that is his message to the nation of Edom, and he does not shirk his responsibility to the nation. Aaron's death, Miriam's death, all of these unseen elements that are celebrated by the parsha are perhaps most beautifully summarized in the song of the well that we find when Israel sang this song in verse 17. Come up, O well, call out to it, well that the princes dug, that the nobles of the people excavated, through a lawgiver and their staffs, a gift from the wilderness. The gift went to the valley, and from the valley to the heights, and from the heights to the valley in the field of Moab, at the top of the peak overlooking the surface of the wilderness. The Song of the Well is another great mystery, and even more mysterious is the fact that this is the song that was sung by the Nisiim, by the princes of all of the tribes, every time the camp would settle under Miriam's jurisdiction and her supervision. The well, which was in her merit, the water would spring forth at the song of the princes. And yet this song is not recorded for 39 years. This is taking place in the 39th year that the well, which moves about with the camp mysteriously in this rock, now, after Miriam has departed, after 39 years, the song is finally recorded by the Torah. And what's more, here in our parsha, the Nisiim, the princes, are not singing the song, but here all of Israel is singing the song and not the princes. Why? This is a great testimony and witness to the greatness of Miriam, because Miriam taught the Nisiim, the princes who taught the people this song. And by teaching them the song, she was really teaching them the nature of Hashem's greatness and how Hashem is relating to them and how everything is really coming from God and what the water is really all about. And during her lifetime, the song was not sung by Israel because it was her responsibility, and it was responsibility that she gave over to the princes. But after Miriam departed, the greatest testimony to her teaching, to her influence on the people, to what she gave over to them, is the fact that now, without the princes, all of Israel were able to sing that song and summon forth the water from the well. And all of these elements in Parashat Chukat are part of the great ongoing tikkun, fixing, that the Jewish people are involved in as we move in our history from one stage to another, rectifying all the aspects of the generation of the desert, remembering the Nachash, the great snake that was hoisted by Moshe Rabbeinu for all to look at, again, a symbol of the entrance to the Garden of Eden, parallel to the purity from death. This is our opportunity to see to it that we transform the land of Israel into the Garden of Eden for the whole world, that we learn from the recorded mistakes of this fabulous, magnificent, holy generation, and that we understand the illusions of all of those things that are not recorded throughout all of those years, so that we can bring to a beautiful climax in our generation the true legacy, the inheritance for all of the people of Israel, the land of Israel.